Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar, Sleep, Stress, and Nutrient Gaps. Today's webinar is the keynote presentation of the Today's Dietitian Spring Symposium. While having the opportunity to see our Today's Dietitian community in person every spring is a highlight of our year, we're still thankful that we are able to gather live online for the 2020 event and share a few of the presentations, like this one, with the larger Today's Dietitian community. And while being a part is different, our having a keynote presentation by a dynamic expert is a familiar highlight, and today's presentation fits that bill. Before we start the presentation, I have 2 points of housekeeping. First, in order to claim your 1.5 CPE credits, you will have to remain with us through the entire 90-minute presentation. Second, at the end of the session, our presenter will be taking questions. If you have a question, please type it in the question box in your control panel, and we will try to address as many questions as time allows. Today's presentation is brought to you free of charge through the generosity of PharmaVite, the makers of the Nature Made brand. Please also note that the accreditation for today's presentation, CDR activity number 155400, was obtained by PharmaVite. Today's speaker has the following disclosures to report. He has served as a consultant for PharmaVite, Cliff Bar, Men's Health, and Now Foods. The speaker certifies that no conflict of interest exists for this program. I'm happy to welcome today's webinar introducer, Dr. Carrie Marshall. Dr. Marshall is an epidemiologist and naturopathic doctor with over 20 years of experience in the natural product industry. She's a recognized expert in nutrition and integrative medicine, women's medicine, pediatrics, and chronic disease management. Dr. Marshall is an international speaker, has published several scientific papers across a range of topics, and is currently the Director of Medical and Scientific Communications for PharmaVite and the Nature Made brand. She maintains a small private integrative medicine practice in Bethesda, Maryland. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Marshall.
Thank you, Jack. I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, who's actually been a friend and colleague of mine for at least half the time that I've spent in the natural product industry, registered dietitian Dr. Chris Mohr, who a lot of you know, and he'll be speaking about a really important topic for our times today, as Jack mentioned, sleep, stress, and nutrient gaps. He's an internationally recognized nutrition expert and is the co-owner of More Results, and he's on the Men's Health magazine advisory board. He was also the consulting sports nutritionist for the Cincinnati Bengals and has worked with select WWE wrestlers to help them with their nutrition programs. So a lot of work in the sports performance arena. His expertise has offered him the opportunity to speak at the White House, the CIA, and to have audiences in over 10 countries in almost all 50 states. He often appears on TV as nutrition guest expert, including appearances with Chef Emeril on CBS's The Talk and also the Montel Williams Show. One of my favorite parts, though, is he's worked alongside LL Cool J as his nutrition consultant and expert for his New York Times bestseller, LL Cool J's Platinum Workout, something we should probably all check out this quarantine. He's also collaborated with fitness celebrities, including Mario Lopez, to write nutrition sections for their books. He has a bachelor's and master's of science in nutrition from the Pennsylvania State University and University of Massachusetts, respectively. He earned his PhD in exercise physiology from the University of Pittsburgh, and he is a registered dietitian. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Mohr.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Carrie and Jack, for putting this all together. And of course, thanks PharmaVite for sponsoring this. Today, what we're going to be talking about, as Jack had mentioned, introduced and carried, sleep, stress, and nutrient gaps. And in essence, what we're going to be talking about is how nutrient gaps can impact individuals throughout their lifespan. Certainly, we're going to talk about how to integrate approaches for improved nutrient intake to maximize health, and then also learn some key strategies around dosing to optimize and reduce stress. So when we first talk about this, when we first think about this, we need to, maybe now more than ever, talk about taking care of you. And what I mean by that is, how do you take care of yourself? And how you take care of yourself really impacts the ability to take care of others, right? So we've all heard, on an airplane, and maybe not recently, but we've all heard in the airplane, of course, put your oxygen mask on first so you can better help other individuals. So my question, we'll bring it to our first poll actually, is what are some of the ways that you actually take care of yourself? And we'll see if we go to the first poll here. You see a variety of different options. So curious, out of those, what are some of the ways that you take care of yourself? And you see, a number of different options here. Yoga or meditation, dietary supplements, exercise, healthy eating, a variety of different options. So I'd just love to see, you can pick as many as you want, but I'd love to see what people are coming up with. And maybe this has changed over the last several weeks. I know it has a little bit for me, but let's see what we've got here. Certainly lots of exercise. I was recently reading an article, how exercise has changed for individuals. And it seems to be increasing slightly for individuals during this time that we're self-quarantining. What else? Looks like a pretty fair balance here. Pretty fair balance among those middles. So exercise for sure, healthy eating. Hopefully it doesn't come as a surprise with this many dietitians on the line. Lots of outdoor activities. Okay, this is excellent. All right. Yoga and meditation, I'm a little lower than I expected. About 18% of people yoga and meditation. I'll add myself to that list as never really doing yoga, but I found this time to embrace that as well. So it looks like, I'll actually share this with the audience. You can see, looks like exercise is the leader in the pack, 58% of the individuals. Certainly healthy eating up there as well, like I had mentioned. Outdoor activities, time with loved ones, and again, maybe that's digitally now, or other also people under your roof. But these aren't surprising, right? So we see lots of this, and we're looking at how do we take care of ourselves. We're going to be talking about some of these today, and specifically looking at the importance of how you rest, how you fuel, and how you move as well. Of course, each of those are independently impacted by the foods we eat, specifically around rest. And rest can mean a number of different things. We can take it literally and think of it as sleep, which we will be talking about today. But rest, that definition can actually be expanded onto, pausing, right? Pausing, again, now more than ever, and I don't want to keep saying that, but amidst this strangeness that we're all part of right now, how are you pausing in your day to find time for you? I've been working with a few different companies on different programs, and I've heard from actually both of them who did surveys with their employees, and these are very, very large corporations. And both of them reported back that the highest number of employees was reported back that they're on average working 12 to 14 hours a day amidst this. So, fortunate to have jobs, but their workload has seemed to increase. So again, we look at that term rest. What are we doing for ourselves to rest in addition to sleep? Like I said, we'll expand on that a little bit, but just pausing in the day. The other piece to this is that each of these can be complemented by quality supplementation. Of course, fuel, we look at the foods we eat, and moving as well. But we know that research continues to suggest there are specific nutrients, which are known as shortfall nutrients, that have been identified as nutrients of public health concern. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on today. But again, we know that all these nutrients not only impact our health, but then according to research, also impact our ability to sleep, certainly recover, and be the best versions of ourselves. So we start to look at, when we think about taking care of ourselves, we start to look at how we're feeling and some of the things that maybe we're hearing from others or feeling ourselves. Things like, I have low energy, or I have common headaches, or it could be more severe with heart issues, blood sugar issues, muscle cramps, poor sleep, all of these and many, many more. When we don't take care of ourselves, when we don't, looking at rest, fuel, and move, and those kind of three pillars, we can get some pretty unpleasant side effects. Now, of course, some of these can come even independently of those three pillars, but very often those are common side effects that so many people are feeling right now, right? Again, right now, or just any time and any days, not even in this strange situation that we're in now. Now, let's actually start with this piece, this pillar rest. And I'll now expand. Again, I said let's talk about pausing in our day and other periods of rest that we can look at, but specifically around sleep. We're going to expand on that a little bit because sleep is really the overarching theme for so much of what we do, and our health and or lack of health, right, can be connected to sleep, and stress as well, which are also tied to each other. This quote is from an author who I've really grown to love. His book, which is called Why We Sleep, Dr. Matthew Walker, and I've listened to him on many, many podcasts and had the opportunity to see him speak in person as well. But I love this quote from him, that the physical and mental impairments caused by one night of bad sleep dwarf those caused by an equivalent absence of food or exercise. So to me, I look at that when we think about the importance of sleep and what it does for us, or doesn't do for us, right? If we don't get the right amount of sleep, it's really critical, okay, when we think about the overall impact of what this can do. Now, when we think about sleep, again, of course, we all need it. We all get it, but do we get optimal amounts of sleep? And that's an important question, right? Because sleep is a very delicate balance in terms of how much we need and certainly how much we get. So I'm going to bring up actually the next poll here, and that is asking how many hours of sleep do you average per night? Okay, so I'm going to have people answer that. How many hours of sleep do you average per night? Now, this one is depending, the audiences I'm talking to. I was giving a talk one time, and one individual came up to me and he said, if I fall asleep during the talk, he said, I promise it's not you. He said, but I've pulled 2 all-nighters this week alone. And he said, and as I started to learn more throughout the day's session, he said that was actually pretty typical during his busy season as an accountant. All right, so I see some answers coming in here. I see the majority, actually, I love to see this. The majority of individuals, about 67%, are getting the 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night. We have about 29% getting 5 to 6 hours of sleep a night. And then we have some who are either less than 4 and some who are over 9 hours. But the majority of individuals look like they're right in that sweet spot of that 7 to 8 hours a night, which is critical for health. And I'll talk more about that, because here are the recommendations. And maybe some of you are familiar with this, but kind of looking from this National Sleep Foundation for adults 18 to 65 years of age, 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night is recommended. And again, we could kind of see the variation for those who have kids or are older adults. It's similar, younger kids need a little bit more than that, certainly. But unfortunately, it's great to see the numbers here that 67% or so were right in that kind of 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. But admittedly, that's not typical. And the average number of hours of sleep per night for most adults is right around 6 hours of sleep, just slightly above that. But again, unfortunately, it's when we start to have that lack of sleep that we start to see some of the dangers associated with it. And again, I'll talk more about what those dangers are, but they become pretty dramatic, even with just a little bit of less sleep than we need. And now I've talked to many, many people who have told me that, I don't need that much sleep. I function optimally on, let's say, 5 hours or 4 hours even. And I do much better with less sleep. But again, according to research, and actually that individual, Matthew Walker, who I mentioned earlier, he said the amount, he has said, and others, the amount of people who need less than the recommended amount of sleep is significantly less than 1%. So the likelihood that you're in that category is minimal. So this slide here, just an interesting slide when we look at the prevalence of short sleep duration by state. So depending where you live there, we look at kind of that southeast-ish area, not doing so well. Looks like my state, I'm in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky. We are almost completely sleep deprived, it looks like, according to this data. So again, nothing more than something of interest, but depending what the state you live in and the patients you work with and see, or clients you talk to, maybe that this is something that we should start considering when we start asking people around about their, whatever they're seeing us for, their nutrition habits, nutrition behaviors, what does sleep look like? Because that has a major impact on so much more as well. Health behaviors, also eating behaviors also. Now, when we look at the impact of sleep disorders on our overall lifespan, so again, we know that short or inadequate sleep, regardless of the cause, adversely impacts health. And this data shows some specific impact of sleep disorders. And honestly, this just scratches the surface with these few disease, heart disease, unintentional injury, stroke, and cancer. So 2014, these were some of the leading causes of death for people under 80, and sleep, or lack of, is connected to every single one of them. Interestingly, and you may have heard this before, but when we look at like heart disease, that one specifically, when we set clocks ahead or behind or back on the spring and fall, the Monday after that's done, heart attacks increase by, depending either spring or fall, 21 to kind of 24% that Monday after the clocks are changed. And that's just 1 hour of sleep difference, right? So when we start to think about how much sleep, how little sleep is really going to impact these things, it doesn't take a lot to have a massive effect on our overall health. Or when I look at that, the other one, unintentional injury, and specifically what comes to mind and what's listed here is drowsy or sleepy drivers. Well, we know that certainly being drowsy is dangerous to be on the road, and the risk of car accidents goes up significantly. Interestingly, there was a study done where it was with high school students, and they intentionally had high school start 1 hour later than normal. And the idea was that teenagers certainly need a good amount of sleep and usually don't get it. What they found after they increased that start of school by 1 hour, and that was the only change made, car accidents decreased in that population by 72%. Now, you might have teenagers, maybe you have had teenagers at some point, or, regardless if you do or don't, again, most of us drive. So we start to look at how this can impact us. Again, as a side note, with that particular study, they also looked at SAT scores, and SAT scores increased by over 200 points when they increased the opportunity of sleep by just 1 hour. So then the question is, how does that impact us, right? We may not be able to stay in bed 1 hour later in the morning, right? But maybe we need to look at, what does that look like in the evening? Maybe binge watching Netflix for many hours of the night isn't the way to go, because we're shortchanging our sleep, or whatever the other reason you might be staying up too long is. Again, looking at some of these other pieces, stroke risk increases certainly with sleep deprivation, and also cancer risk increases with sleep deprivation as well. And again, when I say sleep deprivation, it's not pulling all-nighters on a consistent basis. It can be as little as 1 hour difference in sleep can start to have some of these detriments. Now, it might not be overnight, and likely won't be overnight, but you think over time, we can start to see how this can add up and be dangerous, certainly for our health. So some key individuals or key demographics who commonly have sleep issues: older adults, women, and then various lifestyle factors can play a role. So as we age, there's a higher prevalence of sleep problems among older adults in particular. Like I said, women typically have a higher rate of health issues, and then other lifestyle factors. So lower education status, limited physical functionality, mental health there's a strong association with sleep issues. Certain occupations, so shift workers, whether it's any kind of shift worker, typically has a higher rate of sleep issues. In fact, some countries consider shift work. They actually consider it, they give it hazard pay because of the dangers associated with it. And I know many companies in the US as well for shift workers often pay more than the equivalent individual who's not doing that shift work. So I understand that some of these are out of our control, but just kind of bringing that awareness up of who we often see these more common sleep issues with than others. Now, the other piece to this puzzle is looking how sleep disorders can impact obesity. And of course, that has a huge public impact. So looking at this slide here, so starting on the left, if we get less than 5 hours of sleep at night, there's about a 50% increase or higher risk for obesity because of, one of the reasons, I shouldn't say just because of, but partially because of we have more cravings for sweeter foods, salty and starchy foods. On average, when we get a little bit less sleep, and again, I keep saying less sleep, I'm defining that as about an hour less than what's recommended. So we start to look at about 6 hours of sleep a night or less is when some of these can start to happen. And on average, the data shows that people eat around 300 or so more calories the next day after having a little less sleep. So of course, one night that might not be a big issue, but over time, you can certainly see how that would add up. And that's kind of on the surface. So simply, we typically eat more calories when we have less sleep. But then there's also some hormonal shifts that are going on. We have higher levels of our hunger hormones, lower levels of the appetite controlling hormones. So that's, of course, going to affect our overall intake. And then, this isn't new information for people. Maybe some of these numbers are, but of course, the annual costs of obesity are significant with over $190 billion in medical costs, over $4 billion in absenteeism. There's a lot of less lost work productivity, and then of course higher medical care costs per person. And this is a lot of it can be attributed to sleep. Okay, I'm not saying it's the only cause, certainly, right? But if we there's one big factor, that's that overarching theme that can play such a big role in our daily behaviors. Sleep is that thing, right? So we need to consider the importance of this, hopefully, regular practice. Now, like I said, maybe I'm preaching to the choir here because about 2/3 of you said that you're getting that 7 to 8 hours of sleep, which is amazing. But unfortunately, the data shows most people are not in that same boat. So I like to think of us all as a higher, a group is doing a little bit better with their sleep. Maybe we're more in tune with our health behaviors. When we look at some other factors around sleep, and one of them is sleep apnea, certainly. So, sleep apnea is a specific disease, and again, not something that this would be diagnosed by a sleep expert, a medical professional. But again, we start to look at this in the connection to heart health. And we see how this can be impacted. Sleep apnea can impact so many other things. So you see this cycle here. We have increased sympathetic nerve activity, this metabolic dysregulation. I mentioned that with some of the hormonal shifts that go on, increase in inflammation, etc. I'm not going to read the entire list. But then each of those can lead to things like heart disease and hypertension. Ultimately, that could lead to end-stage cardiovascular disease, respiratory control and instability and upper airway dysfunction, sometimes as a comorbidity to obesity. So we start to see this vicious cycle and how sleep can play a big role. So again, we start to think about the importance of this one simple health behavior and why we need to try to do what we can to change it. Now, today I'm not going to get into some of the sleep hygiene pieces to this puzzle, and that we can go on and on with that list, to be honest, around some of the pieces we're doing. We'll touch a little bit on that, but not necessarily the sleep hygiene factors in terms that we can have to allow us to better control our sleep. But those play a huge role in all of this as well. So let's look at some of the sleep disorders with, and chronic inflammation. Number one, trying not to sleep with the light on, like this individual here with his hand over his head. But we know that research is ongoing as to how sleep impacts immune function. And again, sleep disorders certainly increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, And then that could be possibly through the modulation of our immune system and other mechanisms as well. I was actually recently reading a study where they looked at individuals who got the flu vaccine. And on average, and this study alluded to that a flu vaccine seems to be about 50% effective most of the time. But if an individual did not have adequate sleep the night before they got the flu vaccine, it actually made it significantly even less effective than that 50%, which is pretty powerful. We start to look at how sleep affects our immune system overall and how it can impact us. And again, this is not just less sleep, but also extremes of sleep duration. So even over 9 hours can actually have an association with elevated C-reactive protein, an inflammatory marker as well. So it's not necessarily that more sleep is better, right? So that ideal optimal window is kind of around that 7 to 9 hours is that sweet spot. We start to go more than that, and that's not healthy either. But you do think about, when you are sick, as simple as a cold or a flu or something like that, what is the only thing you want to do, right? And that is that the only thing we want to do is sleep, because that does help, bolster our immune system and help us heal from whatever it is that is making us sick. And continuing on with the sleep and the immune system, this is a really interesting study that came out very, very recently, actually. And it looked at how short sleep can actually make you up to 4 times more likely to catch a cold. So looking at the hours of sleep here, for those who had more than 7 hours of sleep, had about a 17% incidence of catching a cold when exposed to a virus. And you can see how that graph just continues to grow. So a little bit less, 6 to 7 hours of sleep, about almost 23% increase chance of catching a cold. 5 to 6 hours of sleep, a 30% chance. And less than 5 hours of sleep had a 45% chance of catching a cold, again, when exposed to a virus. So pretty powerful when we think about just that little bit of a difference, how that can impact our health outcomes. So I love this study. Again, then we also look at, it's just uncomfortable for us to have a cold, but then CDC data also indicates the common cold costs about $40 billion annually in medical costs and lost productivity. So it's not just that discomfort, it's also a financial discomfort in the long run for employers and everyone else. But what about sleep and cognitive performance? And this part's particularly interesting. Working with a lot of athletes, as when Carrie introduced me, she had mentioned that a lot of the athletes I've worked with in organizations have actually started to bring in sleep experts to talk about the effects of sleep on performance. And that can be, I worked with a basketball team one time, and there was a study that came out recently looking at free throws in a collegiate basketball team. And when, for a college basketball player, a free throw is a pretty straightforward, easy shot. And what they found is when they took 1 hour of sleep, purposely took 1 hour of sleep from the players, their decrease in accuracy went up by about 3%. Now, that may not seem like a lot, right? But translate that to us, right? And the work that we do. And maybe it's the negative effects of when you're giving patient information or education. Do we start to forget more things? Do we start to make more errors in our paperwork? Things along those lines. So it certainly has a big impact on our cognitive performance. Sleep experts actually now say that sleep deprivation seems to be tied to every single mood or brain disorder that is known, whether it's things like bipolar and depression, ADD and ADHD in kids. The Alzheimer's, certainly in adults, there's a significant increase in Alzheimer's risk with lack of sleep over a period of time, which is super concerning. So it's all these little effects that you may not be apparent immediately, but over time can certainly have a really big impact. And essentially what's happening is when we sleep, our brain removes waste, for lack of a better term. And unfortunately, when we have an aggravated sleep pattern, it impairs that waste removal, right? So it's not working as efficiently as it should, because when we sleep, that's when memories are made. It's almost like filing files in a file cabinet, and we store all those throughout the day. We pile all our folders in the filing cabinet. Well, at the end of the day, let's assume we're trying to purge a little bit and clean things out. Well, our brain isn't able to do that as efficiently, maybe not as able to empty that filing cabinet out with the less important memories and tasks throughout the day when we don't get enough sleep. Okay, so again, I keep saying this, but it's so important to emphasize to me is not getting enough sleep is simply, could be as little as 1 hour less than the recommendation. So again, because we know that the brain is certainly our memory center, and that can all be impacted by sleep deprivation. They're actually looking at some of the data in Alzheimer's patients and how their level of REM sleep, that kind of the deep stage sleep, is significantly impacted. So looking at as maybe a correlation there with something going on in the brain, not allowing patients who have Alzheimer's disease to actually go through the deep sleep that they need. So again, certainly it impacts our day-to-day functioning from a health standpoint. Long-term could certainly have a major impact as well. I mentioned this earlier with the better academic performance, and specifically around SAT scores, and how when kids got 1 hour sleep more, their SAT scores increased by about a little over 200 points. Well, that's similar. That's been just outside of SAT scores in collegiate students, university students have found that they have better academic performance with longer sleep duration, certainly better sleep quality as well. So it's not just quantity here, but it's also the quality of sleep that's gotten, and then also the greater sleep consistency. And I haven't mentioned this yet, and I said I wouldn't mention anything really around sleep hygiene, but I will say one thing. That piece about greater sleep consistency, when sleep researchers are typically asked, if I could only do one thing to improve my sleep, what would it be? And the answer is, across the board, being consistent with your sleep patterns, meaning going to bed and waking up at the same time each night and each morning. So even on the weekend, even when you may be able to stay up a little bit later, but having that consistency is particularly important. Another piece that I didn't necessarily mention is that there's actually been some studies that you're also more likable when you get more sleep. And that probably doesn't come as a surprise. We've all been in a position where we've stayed up a little later than we needed to, or maybe had pulled an all-nighter on a more extreme level. I always joke that, with 2 young kids at home, they do not care if I don't get enough sleep the next day. So that I know I'm less likable for them, but even for coworkers, and there's been studies on that to show your coworkers will perceive you as less likable when you get more sleep. So not only will we increase our chance of getting sick, but our coworkers and family members won't like us as much either. At the end of the day, those are both important. So we need to break this cycle, right? We need to think about how do we break this cycle between sleep and then also looking at stress, because it has that secondary effect as well. It increases stress. Okay, we have this big cycle of lack of sleep. Again, the average individual gets about 6 hours of sleep a night, according to research, just slightly over that. Not this group who I'm talking to. Again, like I said, most of you got around 7 to 8 hours of sleep, according to that survey. But we have this, when we have a lack of sleep, with disrupted sleep patterns, whether it's quality or quantity, we have an inability to cope with stressors, which can disrupt our sleep. And then again, we have that fatigue, which diminishes our ability to cope with stressors in a healthy way. And then that leads to the disrupted sleep pattern as well. So again, this is a big vicious cycle. And honestly, I think maybe even more so now than ever with this last kind of 8 weeks, whatever it's been, since we've, been in this situation we're in with COVID and everything. There seem to be, again, according to the papers that have come out, higher rates of anxiety and stress and so on. And again, and difficulty sleeping because of them. When we start to think about some of the symptoms and the physiological or psychological symptoms around stress, here's just a few of them, right? We have decreased sex drive, skin irritations, muscle tension, anger, anxiety, stomach problems, fatigue. The list can go on and on. Right? So these are just some of the many side effects of an increase in stress. Okay, so we need to make sure, trying to get back to how do we maximize our sleep? Okay, that is particularly important. How do we, again, focus on not just the quantity of sleep, but also how do we improve the quality of our sleep as well when we are trying to, be the best we can be, stay as healthy as we can, stay on top of this, reduce stress, and of course, just generally stay healthy overall. Because we look at, again, some of the physical symptoms of stress. And some of the physical symptoms, we know that, just one of the pieces to stress are the hormones related to stress is cortisol, which is the primary stress hormone. And that is our adrenal glands secrete cortisol. They also secrete DHEA, which is one of the most abundant hormones in the body. So we start to look at, stress can come from a number of things, from a natural disaster, from a global pandemic, from whatever it may be, just work piling up or kids being at home. So many different things can lead to that. And unfortunately, it could be, and it could even be something as simple as like before public speaking. It doesn't have to be something such a major impact, but we have these physical symptoms of stress. We have some of the side effects that I talked about earlier. Each of those can impact our sleep, and then lack of sleep can further exacerbate any of those. So we need to make sure that we're taking care of our bodies, okay? It's certainly the adrenal glands, as I talked about, just secrete cortisol and DHEA, and it's one of their jobs to help us adapt to various situations. So we need to make sure we're taking care of our body as best we can. I mentioned cortisol, and this is actually looking at this stress and sleep connection on a hormonal level, and just scratching the surface, but let me kind of just talk you through and orient you to this slide here. So when we look at normal kind of stress and sleep connection on the left versus chronic stress versus burnout on the right. And a commonly used tool for assessing overall adrenal hormone health and is this diurnal cortisol curve. And it's derived from taking 4 daily saliva collections, typically upon waking, before lunch, before dinner, and then before bed as well, then charting them on a graph. And what you can see is this 4-point cortisol curve. And basically, when we look at the association between cortisol, one that's usually associated with energy and wakefulness. So there's an inverse relationship with cortisol and melatonin, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and you've probably heard of, and maybe take yourself. But one is as cortisol increases, typically in the morning, as is shown in the left graph with that black little X there, melatonin decreases. And as the day goes on, that usually fluctuates. So on the flip side, the melatonin increases in the evening, cortisol goes down. But you could see here in times of chronic stress, that middle slide, it's a little bit off from the average, from the quote normal graph on the left, or what you can define as burnout, not a medical term necessarily, but certainly a term that's becoming more prevalent in different circles around. We're hearing so much about this burnout among corporate circles especially, and one of the ways that can be looked at is through cortisol. And you see in this example here on the right side of the graph, the 4 X's are very, very low and never actually increases like it should to have that energy and that wakefulness like is considered a normal pattern. Now, outside of just hormone levels, we see how sleep and nutrient gaps also go hand in hand. Now, right here, what I see on this slide is, short sleep duration has been associated with disease and stress, as I had mentioned. And many researchers have also investigated causes and risk factors for short sleep. So again, yes, it's hygiene. So poor sleep hygiene, ethnic disparities, environmental lifestyle factors, and certainly nutrition plays a role in that. So we see these epidemiological studies have begun to link short sleep duration and other sleep conditions to nutrient intake, which is a pretty interesting correlation. Again, we look at how powerful sleep really is and that it can start to affect our nutrient intake. Earlier I alluded to how we typically eat more, so our calories increase, our energy increases after we have a lack of sleep, upwards of 300 plus calories a day, but then it also affects our nutrient intake. So this particular study was using the NHANES data from 2007, 2008 in that database. And the researchers demonstrated an association of sleep symptoms with intake of several dietary nutrients, as you can see here. They also reported that individuals with very short sleep duration, less than 5 hours, demonstrated the lowest intake of all macronutrients, so protein, carbs, and fat. And then women were most likely to be in the short sleep category compared to men. But we see this discrepancy in the shortfall nutrients here, and looking at the nutrition inadequacy of several of these nutrients here, again, connected to short sleep duration. So now we're seeing how it's impacting us from a health standpoint. Again, not just a calorie increase, but maybe the quality of those calories is going down, right? I mentioned earlier the foods that we typically eat more of when we have less sleep are those higher sugar, higher salty, and then starchier foods could often have a lower nutrient profile. So we see a decrease or increase in these nutrient gaps when we have a short sleep duration. And similarly, we also see an increase in nutrient gaps when we start to look at BMI. So as BMI increases, right, so looking at overweight and obesity research, we start to see a similar decrease in nutrient intake. Okay, so I have a handful of nutrients here, just about 6 nutrients that have been listed. And as you can see here, from the left-hand side, according to, BMI standards, the normal body weight, we see compared to the middle image and then the right image, the nutrients that are listed there continue to decrease as obesity, overweight and obesity increases. Okay, so we start to see this BMI being linked to nutrient shortfalls. Again, the higher the BMI, the greater the shortfall of those particular nutrients. And currently, and again, you've all probably heard this data, but we're at about 70% overweight or obesity in America right now. So again, not surprising to see that there's this big discrepancy, and as we increase in obesity, to have the higher levels of nutrient shortfalls as well. And again, a lot of it could be tied to sleep or lack of. Now, of course, it's not the only thing, right? There's other pillars to this puzzle that we can examine, but sleep is certainly a big one when we start to look at that. So I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to start to examine some of these nutrients, these shortfall nutrients that I brought up in the few previous slides. Again, and talk about some food sources, talk about what we can do to increase the intake of these nutrients, of course, the role they play as well. We'll start with vitamin D. Vitamin D has certainly gotten a lot of press lately in terms of its importance, and then also in terms of its high rates of deficiency, or maybe the better term would be insufficiency, when physicians are starting to test for this vitamin. So vitamin D, the first question I'll ask, and put this poll up, who may have trouble meeting vitamin D requirements? So in this poll, I want you to select all that may apply. So you can see those who wear sunscreen daily, those who live in colder climates, older individuals, darker skinned individuals, those who work inside. So go ahead and pick all that apply when we look at who may have trouble meeting vitamin D requirements. And again, this is one of those shortfall nutrients. All right, see some answers starting to come in here. And it actually looks like pretty even across the board. Starting to shift a little bit. So right now, the leader of the pack is those who work inside. Okay, not surprising there, because we get it from sunlight, certainly. All right, so answer is still changing a little bit, so I'll wait just another few seconds here. Those who live in colder climates starting to rise up. All right, and I'll actually share this with everybody to show what the audience came up with. I see some answers still fluctuating. Let me wait a couple more seconds here. If you haven't answered yet, go ahead and chime on in. vitamin D is certainly one of those vitamins and nutrients that really, again, have come to light recently as one of those nutrients of concern for sure, and shortfall nutrients. But then, just either with some of the athletes I've worked with, some of their physicians have started to add that in testing because of the importance. All right, so I just sent the results to you so you can kind of see what people came up with. So pretty even across the board. Again, those who work inside came to the top, not surprising. Those who, again, the lowest here, you can see, most people did still answer it, but those who wear sunscreen daily. But again, across the board, everyone in that category on that particular poll is actually at a higher risk. So it is all of the above there. Again, that wasn't actually one of the answers, but you could select all of them. So all of the above is really the truth there, is to put people at a higher risk for vitamin D deficiency, or again, maybe I'll use the term insufficiency. So, what does vitamin D do? Why do we even need it? Of course, we know from doing what we do as being dietitians that it's certainly, a nutrient that we need to consume, but it supports the immune cells, immune system. It fights invaders, regulates immune response, reduces risk of cold and flu. We look at vitamin D receptors that are present in cells of the immune system and powerfully regulate that immune system. Fights against those invaders, like I said, bacteria, viruses, and so on. It also aids in calcium absorption. Certainly, that's one of the big ones that are discussed, and of course, that plays a role in bone health. Regulates mineral concentrations, not just calcium, but also phosphorus. And it plays a big role in insulin secretion, in blood pressure regulation. So certainly we know that we need vitamin D. But again, it seems to be a high rate of insufficiency. A physician colleague of mine, when they started testing in their group, and there are a group of 6 physicians in their group, and they started routinely testing vitamin D. And this individual is in New Jersey, and they were finding on average about 97% of their patients were well below the vitamin D standards. Similarly, I know when I worked with one of the pro football teams, and one of the physicians started testing there, they were similarly low. Again, they're in the 90% or so of individuals on the team did have lower vitamin D levels. So the question then becomes is, where do we get it from food? Well, certainly, I guess that's not food specifically, but sun exposure. Unfortunately, we're getting into the springtime, so depending where you live, you might be able to get out a little bit more. But what's interesting about that is, and it says there, 15 minutes of full sun exposure. Years ago, I was interviewing a vitamin D researcher, the late Dr. Robert Heaney, who's one of the biggest names in the vitamin D space, and he joked that we know we get it from sun, but unless you're standing outside naked without your clothes on for about 15 minutes without sunscreen, you're not going to make sufficient amounts. He said, so, even when you're outside, as we typically would be with maybe a short sleeve or shorts or a skirt, it's not necessarily enough skin exposure to truly make vitamin D as needed. So that's one big piece to it. And then, of course, depending where you live, where you live, that will determine the strength of the sun as well, or the time of year. So if you're in the more northern states, most of the year, the sun isn't strong enough anyway to actually get sufficient amounts of vitamin D. So it is one of those, as we know, one of those ones that's a little bit more difficult to get. Again, there are some foods that provide vitamin D. Fish like trout, for example, provides some, as you can see, or salmon provides a decent amount of vitamin D. It's canned as well, or wild, or canned or fresh, I meant to say. And wild mushrooms, the ones that are exposed to UV light, actually provide some vitamin D as well. Of course, dairy does, fortified milk does as well. So we do get it. And again, I'm not saying anything that folks don't know here, but vitamin D is a more challenging one to get. So we need to consider that when we're talking to patients in terms of looking at how to actually provide this information to them, right? So right now, the RDA is 600 IUs a day. But 95% or 98% of Americans don't eat enough vitamin D. So we're not quite getting enough vitamin D through the diet. And depending on who you talk to, what research you look at, like I said, the RDA is currently 600 IUs. Some governing bodies, the Endocrine Society, actually recommends a little bit higher amount, maybe 1,500 to 2,000 IUs. Again, then I'm not just saying blindly start taking vitamin D or advising your patients to do so. In an ideal setting, we'd have a blood marker to let us know what our vitamin D status is. But again, it is one of those common shortfall nutrients. And even here's a personal example. Several years ago, so I live in Louisville, Kentucky, as I mentioned earlier. So this was actually 2008, so 12 years ago. I was training for the Ironman here in Louisville. And at the time, it was in August. So I was out in the sun a lot of the day, whether it was riding or swimming or what have you, or running. And out of curiosity, again, I did not take vitamin D then. I was thinking I was out in the sun so much with a whole bunch of sunblock on, because sometimes my days were 8 or 10 hours outside, that, there was no way that vitamin D was a concern. And I ended up coincidentally having some blood work done from my physician, and it was towards the end of the summer, and my levels were actually in the clinical deficiency stage at that point. So again, that's an N of one anecdotal data, but I think that seems to be consistent with a lot of people, again, with putting sunblock on and not having a ton of skin exposure, and then again, because it's difficult to get in the diet. So we need to look at how this plays a role and how we can best advise patients to make sure that we're getting more vitamin D. Again, safely, of course. It is a fat-soluble vitamin, as we all know, so I'm not saying blindly just start taking it, thousands and thousands of IUs, but there are some data that certainly people should increase their intake, especially if they have that deficiency, of course, under the guidance of hopefully a dietitian and their physician. But we look at what is optimal vitamin D dosing according to, again, a lot of governing bodies. So potentially commonly recommended doses for vitamin D maintenance, depending on who you're talking to or research studies you might look at. 1,000 to 2,000 IUs a day is not uncommon. To look at restoring vitamin D levels if we have deficiency or insufficiency, 5,000 or IUs or more per day. Again, that individual I mentioned earlier, Dr. Bob Heaney, said they were at a vitamin D conference one time, and this is, again, just kind of anecdotal data here, but he had mentioned this. There were a couple dozen vitamin D researchers, and they said they actually just passed a paper around and said, asking everybody what they take in terms of vitamin D, and the average answer was 5,000 IUs a day in that group of vitamin D researchers. Again, I'm not saying this is what we should all blindly just do, but that was interesting to hear from him, someone who devoted his entire life pretty much to studying vitamin D. Again, then you can look at, looking at there's some higher doses, always within the recommendation and, talking with your practitioner, of course, and making sure your patients do that as well. But we know, like I said, like we showed earlier, the individuals who are at higher risk of vitamin D, certainly if we're wearing sunscreen all the time, we're working indoors, we have darker skin pigmentation, living in those northern latitudes, lack of vitamin D fortified foods in the diet, obese individuals as well. Their BMI, as I mentioned, is connected to vitamin D status and one of those shortfall nutrients, whereas looking at, because it's a fat-soluble vitamin, they think that it's diluted potentially within the additional fat cells. So there's some higher risk in that population as well. So again, one of those shortfall nutrients, we start to look at the needs and making sure that we're getting enough. Shifting gears to our next nutrient, we'll actually look at magnesium. Again, this is one of the shortfall nutrients as well. And about 55% of the population seems to have insufficient intake of magnesium from diet alone. And like I said earlier, the recent Dietary Guidelines, 2015-2020 Dietary Guidelines included magnesium as one of those underconsumed nutrients. So that being said, I'm going to ask another poll question. What is the best food source of magnesium on this list. We're going to test our dietitian knowledge here. No Googling allowed. Let's see what we come up with as the best source of magnesium from the foods that we have. All right, I see some answers starting to come in. Pretty consistent. All right, looks like we're doing well. Past that class, going back to nutrition education, past that class on magnesium, looks like majority of folks picked almonds. 47% of you picked almonds, and that is the correct answer out of that list. So just to kind of read the answers to you, most of you picked almonds, about 28% picked beans, 17% or so picked spinach, and then very few picked bananas and milk. So lots of different options there. We look at the magnesium, but out of that list, almonds is the #1 source. Now, the question is, what does magnesium do? Why do we need this important mineral? Well, one, it's the 4th most abundant mineral in the body, and it's linked to over 300 metabolic reactions, nerve and muscle tissue functions. So certainly an essential trace mineral that plays a big role in regulating the balance of calcium and sodium in our cells, helps promote a steady heart rhythm. And of course, like many vitamins and minerals, we need that proper intake of magnesium through food sources, always ideal. Again, food first for sure, to get that adequate level and healthy balance. But unfortunately, it seems to be one of those shortfall nutrients where we are not quite doing enough in the grand scheme of things. So one of the pieces where magnesium plays a role, again, in over 300 different actions in the body, well, it plays a role in the brain. And one study actually showed that it's likely that magnesium deficiency can cause most major depression and related mental health illnesses, IQ loss, and addictions, which is pretty scary. So the authors concluded, we suggest that magnesium deficiency as a cause of these disorders is enormously important to public health and is recommended for immediate widespread further study. So pretty powerful when you think about how important this mineral is. And again, especially concerning that it is one of the shortfall nutrients. Like I said, it also plays a role in muscles and in the active transport of calcium and potassium. So certainly that plays a role in nerve impulse conduction, muscle contraction, and of course, normal heart rate and rhythm. Also, it plays a big role in overall muscle relaxation, which is, on a very, very basic scale, think about milk of magnesia and what that specifically is and the function of that when we think about the role of magnesium. Now, that's not necessarily the side effect we want all the time, but just kind of putting things into perspective when we start to look at the functions of magnesium. And then also from a muscle relaxation, could there be a role when we look at sleep? And then again, coming back to stress and sleep and the role magnesium plays among them. So I brought up the poll earlier with the sources of magnesium intake, and these are some of the foods listed in that previous poll. But again, almonds, the top source in the one that I listed, so 80 milligrams on an ounce, which is about a handful of almonds. Again, spinach certainly has some, shredded wheat, and other sources you can see there as well. So unfortunately, though, about a little over 50% of Americans don't eat enough magnesium. So we need to see we can get more in the diet and how we can get more in the diet. Certainly, again, food first, always, but then looking at supplementation if necessary to make sure we're optimizing our intake. Right? It's not just about meeting the minimum requirements, but what does optimal look like? Again, you can see from a dose standpoint, it's about 310 to 420 milligrams, but most of us are not close to that. Speaking of being not close to our intake of what we need, let's shift gears and look at omega-3 fats. Omega-3 fats, once again, I like to start off with some polls, test our knowledge. And the poll here is, what is the 2015-2020 guidelines for Americans, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans recommendation for the frequency of eating seafood? Okay, so once again, putting on our dietitian hats, making sure that we have this answer. So is it 1 serving per day? Is it 1 serving per week? Is it 2 servings per week? Or is it 4 servings per week? Wow, no hesitation here. We see most of the people coming in strong with the correct answer, but I'm not going to give it away because numbers seem to be changing a little bit. All right, it does look like most of the answers have come in, and 86% of you have the correct answer, which is 2 servings per week. Again, some folks look to 4 servings per week, and then on the other end of the spectrum, 1 serving per week or 1 serving per day. Okay, so most of you got that one correct, 85% of you, or almost 86% of you. And let's talk about omega-3s and their important role. Of course, we know that omega-3s are an essential nutrient. So we look at, from eye health to triglyceride levels, brain health, heart health, blood pressure, and the list can go on and on. We think about omega-3 specifically, and I'll expand on this, but EPA and DHA are two of the omega-3s, and the ones that we'll focus on mostly here. But there's over 40,000 published studies on omega-3s. Again, making them one of the most studied nutrients in the world. That's a powerful statement. We think about all the research that's been done on just vitamins, minerals, and macronutrients as well. But again, EPA and DHA specifically are important for brain, eyes, heart, triglyceride levels, blood pressure. Like I said, really every cell is a function here. There are other omega-3s, so it's not just EPA and DHA. There is also ALA. But I can't emphasize enough that ALA is not the same, okay? That is not the same. ALA is important, and I'll talk about some of the food differences for each of those, but EPA and DHA are the ones that have shown to have these benefits. And the reason to note this is because we do get a decent amount of ALA, but the conversion of ALA to the others, EPA and DHA, is very, very low. It seems to be about, I've seen kind of less than 10% or so of that conversion. So pretty low, meaning when we're eating chia seed and flaxseed and hemp seed and nuts, all great foods, but not necessarily the same and not enough. So when we think about omega-3s and we start to think about, one of their roles, and specifically around brain health and depression, anxiety, inflammation specifically, one of the pieces and just mental health pathology overall. So the role that polyunsaturated fats play in mental health, very often it can be connected to this low-grade inflammation. And where does that come from? Well, it can very simply, again, we can get into the mechanisms here, and we will a tiny bit, but unfortunately, we're eating a lot more omega-6s compared to omega-3s. And omega-6s are essential as well, but we're way out of balance when looking at data in terms of what is recommended for the intake of those different fatty acids, right? So we're eating more omega-6s compared to omega-3s. Now, where do we get omega-3s? Again, it could be from fish to provide EPA and DHA. It could also be from algae. That's, especially if you're a vegetarian or a vegan. There's other sources, but fish seem to be the most prevalent or typical or common source. But more likely or more common, we're eating a good dose of omega-6s, which come from a lot of the vegetable oils, corn, soybean oil, things like that, which may be, you may not be eating them directly, purposely, but maybe they're in a lot of the foods that we eat. So again, we'll look at what should the recommendation be around that ratio between 6s and 3s. And there are ways to test what your omega-3 levels are, have your patients do that as well. So again, we're going to get into some of the mechanisms here, just very, very briefly, but essentially omega-6s can have inflammatory activity affecting some of the prostaglandins, lipoxins. Certainly omega-3s have an opposing role there. So they decrease. They have an anti-inflammatory activity. They affect the endocannabinoid system, which is a term you may have heard very recently with the popularity of CBD. Whole other topic we're not going to touch on, but that one has come up in the news lately. But omega-3s play a role as well with that system, and also the serotonin pathway. We start to look at the role it plays in health, mental health, and also we look at, again, sleep and stress, and it is one of those shortfall nutrients. Now, looking at this particular slide here, we look at the recommendation around, or the trials that have gone on, around omega-3s and mood disorders, again, playing a role in brain health, which is one of the big benefits and outcomes of omega-3 supplementation. Well, looking at this is just a handful of randomized controlled trials that have been done. So you can see on the slide the different dosing of EPA and DHA, looking at the outcomes and the conditions that were measured, and then looking at the potential benefit of omega-3, either as a monotherapy or in conjunction with, in this case, antidepressants. So looking at the role omega-3s can play with mood disorders. So there does seem to be, from this abundance of data, and this is just barely scratching the surface of the studies that have been done on this area, but conclusive evidence shows that omega-3s plus antidepressants seem to work better than monotherapy. But the key is the dosing here. And it seems to be that we need about at least 1,000 milligrams of EPA, specifically with a higher ratio of EPA to DHA. Now, again, some studies have used even more than that, with 1 to 2 grams of total EPA and DHA, but at least 1 gram of EPA here within that total seems to be of benefit, of a strong benefit. And on a very simple level, the primary fat within our brain is DHA. So our brains are very, very fatty tissues. So we have an abundance of omega-3 within our brain. And again, a lot of data continues to emerge on this in this area. Now, I'm not saying omega-3s can cure anything, of course, but in conjunction with whatever the treatment your practitioner has recommended, there seems to be some powerful data in this area. Now, another specific, we look at brain health and look at this particular one was with the Women's Health Initiative memory study. And what they looked at was actually, they specifically measured an omega-3 index. So that is the way that some researchers and labs would actually measure the omega-3s within your blood. I briefly alluded to that earlier as something that can be done. You could have your omega-3 levels and omega-6s tested, which is, I think, very, very interesting to see. So you can actually truly provide this information to yourself or to patients. But from the data that's been done and looking at the omega-3 index, again, which is kind of looking at the red blood cell count of EPA and DHA, those who had a higher level of omega-3 index, a higher over 8% of the omega-3 index, was associated with a 31% lower risk of death over 14 years. And this was part of, like I said, a larger, the Women's Initiative memory study. And then there's certainly an emerging data looking at the research to show the prevention or reduction of cognitive decline. So particularly important, again, specifically with the aging population, we look at the role omega-3s could play here. Now, again, I am not saying that omega-3s will eliminate cognitive decline. I wish it were that simple. But again, there's some very, very promising data in this area. Now, the question is, where do we get omega-3s? And then also looking at what are the ratios of 6s to 3s, as I brought up earlier. Well, currently the Institute of, or I should say Americans Eat, you see that's the second graph from the left. The ratio is about 16 to 1. Honestly, I've seen one study that was as high as 30 to 1, but most are kind of in that 16 or so grams of omega-6s for every 1 gram of omega-3. The Institute of Medicine recommends a much lower ratio, so about a 5 to 10 gram of 6s for every 1 gram of omega-3s. Now, again, this is challenging or really impossible to know what your levels are unless you actually get it tested, like I said, with that omega-3 index or the other blood markers that are out there. But where do we get omega-3s. I mentioned earlier, the couple servings of fatty fish per week, whether that's salmon, whether that's herring, anchovies, sardines. I know a few people might raise their hand that they actually like sardines. I'm one of them, but I know they're not the most popular. But then also, so of course, other fish as well. Tuna is a common one. But then we can also look at some plant sources. So it's not just fish, although fish are going to provide that direct source of EPA and DHA. Or, as I mentioned earlier, again, supplemental, fish oil or omega-3s. But then also, if someone's a vegan or a vegetarian, then maybe algae is their recommended or preferred source of omega-3s. And there are a variety of algae-based supplements and products on the market as well, which is where fish get their product or their omega-3s from. But then we can get some plant sources of omega-3s too. Like I said, though, those contain ALA, which is not to say it's unimportant. It is crucial, it is essential, but it's not the same as EPA and DHA when we start to look at the outcome data. So the flaxseed, the chia seed, hemp seed, walnuts, and other nuts, all can provide some omega-3s. But look at that little star in the upper right-hand corner. Nearly 95% of Americans aren't eating enough omega-3s. So we have a long way to go when we look at the optimal intake to make sure we're optimizing. Again, it's not just about minimizing or making sure we don't have a deficiency, but how can we optimize intake? Now, the last piece on this that I'll bring up, because this question comes up all the time, is if I'm talking to a patient or if I'm looking at a supplement myself, how do I know how much to take? Right? It's super confusing. Well, hopefully this will help you with some of that. So, in addition to the food sources that I just showed in the previous slide, from a supplemental standpoint, in general, we want to look at the two numbers on the supplement label, and those numbers are EPA and DHA. And we want those to add up to at least 500 milligrams per serving. I've talked to people about this and how much are you taking, and people might tell me, I don't know, I take a capsule or 2 capsules or a teaspoon, but that's meaningless. We need to see how much EPA and DHA is in each serving of whatever you might be taking. And ideally, you want about 500 milligrams per serving. There are certainly some products with higher doses than that. But we want to make sure most of what we're getting in the supplements is that EPA and DHA, because again, these are where the benefits seem to come from. Now, this is from, again, you can get this from fish oil supplements. There are also algae-based supplements, and the bioavailability of those seems to be great as well. Seems to be the data is impressive in algae-based supplements. Again, if someone or you or a patient is a vegetarian or a vegan or not interested in taking fish oil, but algae is certainly an option when we think about the amount. Again, just looking at the label, seeing what the doses are, making sure you're getting an adequate dose of omega-3s, and ideally looking at that at least 500 milligrams per serving. And again, there are some, whether it's fish oil or algae products, there are some high-dose algae products as well, which I think is great. So the options are endless for the patients who need some higher amounts. Now, again, when I say higher amounts, what does that look like? Well, this slide is based on the omega-3 index, again, which is a specific way to test your levels of omega-3s within your body. And most Americans, the average majority of Americans, are about a 4% index. And most experts ideally want, when we look at the omega-3s, want us to be a little bit higher than that, kind of 8 to 10% index for some of these benefits. Well, for the benefits I talked about, and you could see the amount of EPA and DHA it would take on the right side of that table to increase your omega-3 index depending on where you are. So again, some 2% index can go upwards of 2,000 or almost 3,000 milligrams of EPA and DHA. Again, that's different than just your total omega-3s. All right, shifting gears away from omega-3, certainly an important supplement, but shifting gears to another interesting one that has been, it is an interesting one, particularly around sleep. And I'm going to bring up another poll, as I like to do with each of these supplements. What is another common name for ashwagandha? Anybody know? Another common name for ashwagandha. We have a few different options here. Indian winter cherry, black cohosh, goatweed, bearberry, garden heliotrope. A lot of interesting options out there. Any guesses? We have the majority of people saying black cohosh so far. I don't want to sway you though if you haven't yet voted, because according to the numbers, not everyone's put in their vote. Remember, you're behind the screen, so no one will know. It's okay to guess. It does look like most people are still picking black cohosh, about 56%, with the next about 27% coming in with Indian winter cherry. And it looks like this seems to be about our final numbers. Well, the answer is Indian winter cherry is another name for ashwagandha. Okay, so black cohosh is popular as well, not necessarily for sleep, completely different product. But it is Indian winter cherry is that other name. So what is ashwagandha? What can be used for? Well, you can see that potentially it reduces perceived stress, and higher doses may improve blood pressure. Higher doses may reduce markers of oxidative stress. And this is where most of the data seems to be around stress. And that's the role that the ashwagandha can play. Maybe playing a role with elevated cortisol levels, again, which could be common if you remember from earlier for those who are having trouble falling asleep. Remember, cortisol and melatonin have an inverted relationship. When one goes up, the other goes down. So if there's elevated cortisol potentially and stress potentially, ashwagandha may be able to help that situation if someone does have an impact on or a negative effect on their sleep. So here seems to be the optimal intake according to research with most of the data. So improved nutrient intake for maximum health is around 125 milligrams a day. Again, it could be taken day or night. We do know that the extracts have different potencies, so we'll talk about how to look for a quality supplement in just a little bit. Doesn't have the most exciting flavor, but so typically it's mixed in with smoothies and you can mask the taste, or even hot warm milk is a typical kind of evening type drink for some people. So maybe it could be mixed in with warm milk as something to try. Again, when we start to look at how do we optimize our sleep, well, this could be one of the many benefits. I'm not saying it is the cure-all and answer. When we start to look at getting the maximum quality, quantity of sleep, if it is a challenge, maybe this is something to consider among looking at other health behaviors, sleep hygiene, etc. All right, and moving on to a different product, which is L-theanine, a different ingredient. So here's my quiz for you today. My poll for you is: research indicates that L-theanine promotes, is it A, deep sleep? Is it B, relaxation without drowsiness? Is it C, quick reflexes? Or is it D, digestive health? So those are the three options for you. And any answers coming? All right, now looking, actually not seeing the answers for this one, not seeing the guesses for this one.
Dr. Mohr, I'll jump in and
Okay.
You have deep sleep at 34%, relaxation without drowsiness at 54%, and quick reflexes and digestive health, negligible.
Okay. And so there you go. So the answer is actually relaxation without drowsiness. And I think you said that was, what, 55%? Oh, yeah. Is that what you said, 55?
55%.
There you go. Okay, so good guess, everybody, or educated guess. Maybe it was more than a guess. So yes, L-theanine may help relaxation without drowsiness, which that sounds super promising for me. I like the idea of that. So you look at this next slide here, and what is L-theanine? Well, it's an amino acid found naturally in green and black tea. It's not produced by the body, but and it's not essential for humans. It can play a role with serotonin and dopamine in the brain. So this is how we look at, may affect that sleepiness without the drowsiness, the relaxation, I should say, is the better word. Better sleep quality. So again, going back to sleep, we need to look at quality and quantity. Where do we get theanine from food, L-theanine? Well, it kind of got its popularity, I think, from green tea or black tea. So it's in both of those products, but it doesn't seem to, it's not tremendously high doses. Also in boletus mushrooms is another food that it's in, but it's not one that's typically common throughout the food supply. But when we look at those two sources, but from a supplement standpoint, obviously we can get that from supplements, and there's some promising data, like I said, that it may improve the quality of sleep. You see the dosing, according to research, is about 200 milligrams for the optimal intake. So look at that from L-theanine as another opportunity to maybe consider something when we think about how do I maximize the quality of my sleep. All right, this one, I'm going to shift gears to melatonin. Melatonin is one that many of you have probably heard of, maybe even more than the others. Maybe many of you take or have taken, but I will have another poll come up. Is melatonin found naturally in foods? Straightforward, true or false? Is melatonin found in foods? What do we think? Melatonin is one that's gotten a lot of popularity lately. And Jack, I'm going to ask you to read the answers again if you don't mind, because I'm not seeing anything on my screen.
Sure, the answers are populating. And true is coming in at 38%, false coming in at 62%.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, let's talk through this. I'm going to keep you on the edge of your seats what the correct answer is, if it was true or false, for just a second. But let's look at the role of melatonin, what it does, why it's important. Basically, it assists with the timing of circadian rhythm. We have this 24-hour internal clock, and it is a hormone produced by the brain in response to darkness. In other words, if you're staring at a device at night, like this individual on the screen right now, that's going to impact melatonin. And there's some researchers who call it having a melatonin hangover, which if it's not fluctuating properly throughout the day, then unfortunately, it may not be affecting the quality of the sleep that you need. Because light regulates melatonin production. That's why some of the things like blue blocking glasses have gotten popular, so people can continue to stare at devices in the evening, but not have such a strong effect. Ideally, we'd say that we wouldn't stare at them at all, but that is a big role of melatonin, how it affects us, our sleepiness, our drowsiness, and allows us to get that quality of sleep. So melatonin supplements may help with certain conditions, such as jet lag in particular. That's where most of the data around melatonin seem to lie, is the effect on jet lag, delayed sleep-wake disorders, some sleep disorders in children, anxiety before surgery. But, a lot of the data, the promising data, seems to be around jet lag and the change of travel across multiple time zones. So when we look at, the sleep and wake cycle hormones and how they play a role in our body, again, they have opposite, melatonin and cortisol have opposite effects, as I mentioned, is how you can see in this slide. So in the evening, melatonin increases, cortisol typically decreases as we're getting ready for our sleepy time. But if we're staring at devices and have light in our eyes, unfortunately, that negatively affects that impacts the melatonin production and does not allow us to get that deep quality of sleep we need. And I will now, drumroll please, reveal the answer to that poll. It absolutely is found in foods. And looking at the food, so I'll say that interesting, when I was doing the research for this, tart cherries have gotten a ton of attention around melatonin. But take a close look at the levels in some of those foods. So you can see it's about 13 for tart cherries, 13 nanograms per gram. Skip over a little bit to pistachios, and that is actually not a typo. I looked at it with glasses as close as I could, but pistachios have 228,000 nanograms per gram of melatonin in that, which is pretty powerful from a food perspective, looking at compared to the other options there. So just something to put in perspective. Again, all of those seem to be great foods. I wouldn't recommend coffee right before bed or wine for that matter. But again, from a food perspective, we do get some melatonin. Of course, you can get it from supplements as well. So let's take a look at some nutrient supplementation pieces, and I'm going to kind of wrap up here with these last just couple slides. And I'll just have a poll for you. We talked about a variety of nutrients, and here's the last poll of the talk. What dietary supplements do you take, if any, on a regular basis? And you can select all of them that apply. So I'll have that trigger that survey again and see what you come up with. So there were a variety of the ones I talked about on that particular list and some others. So omega-3s, vitamin D, magnesium, botanicals, multivitamins, other.
As we move through the list, we have 30% of respondents taking omega-3s, 55 taking vitamin D, 18 taking magnesium, 6 using botanicals, 52% taking multivitamins, 20% calcium, 25 probiotics, and another 20% taking another supplement.
Okay. All right. So that was more just out of curiosity to kind of see where people lie in terms of their nutrient or supplemental practices. So it's interesting. Again, we talked about some of those, not all of them, and that's maybe a whole other talk when we look at all of those. But it's interesting to see, what people take, what people talk to their clients about and patients about. But if we go to the next slide here, and again, I think the our overarching theme here was looking at the nutrient shortfalls that can be associated specifically with short sleep. We started talking about sleep, the role it plays in, of course, health overall, stress, and nutrient shortfalls. We start to see some of the data. And this is a study that Nature Made did fund themselves and do, and some of the researchers here from the Nature Made team. But we look at basically assessing as we got more sleep, started to close the gap. As the subjects got more shorter sleep, or increased sleep, started to close the gap on the nutrient shortfalls, which I think is important. So comes back to the big theme. Number one, we need more sleep. Again, this group was pretty good with their sleep. If I remember correctly, about 67% said they got 7 to 8 hours of sleep. But I can't beat that drum loud enough that sleep is crucial. When we think about supplements, I'll wrap up with this. The one question that does come up all the time is, how do we choose a supplement? Well, we need to look at quality. We need to look at sourcing, quality ingredient sourcing. As a practitioner not involved in the supplement space, maybe we can't do that. But what do we look for from a company? Well, one of the ways to do that is this USP verified symbol. And essentially what that means is the ingredient, what's on the label is in the product, the ingredient is in there. It doesn't say that, it doesn't prove that the product works or doesn't work. It's not that, but it's that we can verify the quality of the actual ingredients in the product. And I think that's a very important message when we think about the quality of supplements, because there's a lot of options out there. But all of that said, again, going to beat that drum again, to get more sleep, we have those nutrient shortfalls, certainly talk to patients about them. And then again, if supplementation is necessary as a complement, let's certainly consider that as well. So that being said, Jack, I know we're kind of at the time, and I'm going to open it up for questions if there's time for questions or questions that have come through.
You've gotten lots of questions. Given that we're right at the hour and a half, why don't we jump into the questions that really appeared in groups? And there's about 5 or 6 questions that really were asked in large quantities. So if you're good with staying on for a few more minutes, we can hop into those. You did touch on shift work, but many attendees are asking if there was a difference between whether people are sleeping at night or during the day. Is daytime sleep problematic even in and of itself, even if the person is achieving the desired 7 to 9 hours?
Oh, great question. And it does seem to still be different. Yes, because that the natural circadian rhythm does seem to still be impacted if we aren't getting the adequate, I guess, even the adequate timing of sleep, but not necessarily the adequate, I guess, the quote unquote regular evening, nighttime sleep, that it doesn't seem to be regulated. Our circadian rhythm is still off, even if we're getting the right amount. Now, that being said, I know that there's some situations of people who are certainly, have to work shift work. So the way the question came through, if you're still trying to at least get the adequate quantity of sleep, even if it's not optimal, is still better than not doing that at all.
Thank you. And that's similar to a second question that came in with large frequency. And there were lots of questions on disrupted sleep. I assume it's better for it to be 7 to 9 of consecutive hours, but should people be shooting for 7 to 9, even if there's disruptions in their night's sleep?
Yeah, ideally, yes. And again, there are certain things, certain life stages we can't necessarily control. Whether that's a parent with young kids and they're waking up, or hormonal shifts as we get older, and that's changing the consistency of sleep. Ideally, optimally, if we can get that consistency, yes, that'd be great. I know that's not always possible. So again, we didn't really talk about sleep hygiene in this particular session, but that's something to start to look at. What are we doing that we can control within our day-to-day routine in terms of, again, not covering everything, but like alcohol intake, caffeine intake, and so many other factors that can play a role in our sleep hygiene. Again, understanding certain life stages impact the quality of sleep, but if we can be as consistent as possible, that would be great. If you're waking up in the middle of the night and absolutely not able to fall back asleep, usually sleep researchers suggest leaving your bedroom, like only associating that bed with sleep. So you get out of the bedroom so you're not, pick up your phone or computer or something else and start to disrupt that sleep pattern and have that association of the bed doesn't just mean sleep.
Thank you. The next question can probably serve as its own separate session, but it was really frequently asked, so I'm going to ask it of you. And it's the chicken or egg question, and whether or not there's been any research between does obesity and nutrient shortfall or nutrient shortfalls occur because of lack of sleep, or does lack of sleep occur as a result of obesity and or nutrient shortfalls?
Yeah, it could be that chicken and the egg, like you mentioned. So it becomes a kind of an evil cycle, essentially, where those who are often overweight, obese, sometimes that can impact, of course, the quality of sleep, which then could then turn back around and increase the level of obesity or overweight as well. So can't say one causes the other, but there does seem to be a correlation between those. But it probably is that chicken or the egg situation, which is why we want to control as much as we can control. We want to do so to try to get our behaviors aligned with the health outcomes that we desire.
Okay. Why don't we address one final question that was frequently submitted. And I'll tell you, these questions really were telling about our attendees' habits, because I think that people are really thinking about sleep in an inquisitive way. So here is one. We have a lot of people on today who are using sleep trackers. And there's two questions that come out of this usage. First, how accurate do you find sleep trackers to be? And then second, and more importantly, how much deep sleep does a person need when they're looking at the sleep tracker data?
Yeah, excellent question, and one I have asked myself. And actually had the opportunity to write an article for Men's Health where I looked at a lot of these different sleep trackers and devices and interviewed some sleep experts who, again, I can read the research, but these are the people who do the research. And the consistent answer seems to be they're what you want to look at is the trends of them. The night-to-night data may not be as accurate, but if you look at the overall trend, meaning like over 30 days, for example, what does my deep sleep, et cetera, REM, what do the different stages look like? And depending on the device, they measure different things. So look at the trends, don't get caught up in the day-to-day data. That being said, if you know that, like, again, for example, I have one of those rings that measures sleep and a watch, and I know that they often don't match up in terms of their data the next morning. But I start to look at that at the end of the month, and if I knew there were maybe times that I stayed up later, maybe I drank more alcohol, maybe I had coffee later in the day, a lot of the behaviors that we know to impact sleep, then you can usually see a resultant effect the next day. But again, the sleep research I've seen and the researchers I've talked to say, generally they're okay. Take them with a grain of salt. If they're making you more anxious than anything, then maybe they're not the best. But again, do we need to run out and all buy one of these devices? And there's many, many ones now out there. Not necessarily. If you think it may help you track some of your behaviors, great. But again, if it's causing anxiety, that the deep sleep is a little percent less or a little bit higher than it was the day before, you don't want to get too caught up in that and also affect your sleep in a negative way. The second part of the question, I think, was what's the amount of deep sleep we get? And in general, healthy adults roughly get about 1 to 2 hours of deep sleep per 8 hours of nightly sleep. So whether your device looks at that, I know the ring that I have does list deep sleep as one of the options. Again, some devices don't, and like I said as well, the watch that I have in the ring don't often match up in the outcome data. So that's generally what we need, that 1 to 2 hours of deep sleep. Really, as of now, I think trackers are getting much better. But as of now, most experts say the only true way to get the measure of sleep is actually going to a sleep lab and being hooked up to all the different devices.
All right. Well, thanks for being generous with your time and staying over. I wanted to make sure that we hit those questions that were really submitted in groupings.
No, absolutely. This is great. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, there was a lot of excitement and anticipation for today's presentation, Dr. Mohr, and thank you for sharing your expertise and enthusiasm with the Today's Dietitian audience. This was certainly a worthy kickoff to this year's spring symposium.
I appreciate it, Jack, and thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you also to Pharmavite, the makers of the Nature Made brand, for supporting today's dietitians and its audience through quality programming like the webinar you just experienced.
Instructions for credit claiming and downloading handouts should be up on your screen.
You must complete a brief evaluation of the course in order to claim your credit and download your certificate. Registered dietitians should use code 175 when recording this activity in their professional development portfolio. If you are watching this webinar on our YouTube channel, please log into ce.todaysdietitian.com, click on the Webinars tab, and select this webinar in order to complete it for credit. If you are watching this webinar on our CE Learning Library website, click Next, or return to the course start page and select the evaluation step to complete this webinar for credit.